I was in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I had done an event early that morning with the mayor, and I was due to meet my wife and my two children, then 4 years old and one, on the train platform in Bridgeport to head down to New York City to spend the rest of that Friday afternoon with my young kids, their first chance to see the Christmas decorations of the city. I received a phone call while on the train platform telling me that something had happened in Sandy Hook, Connecticut. Sandy Hook is a section of Newtown, Connecticut. I debated whether or not to still go down to New York, but as the news started to become more clear, I got in the car and headed up to the firehouse just down a short road from Sandy Hook Elementary School, where an emergency response effort was gathering. It was there that 20 parents found out what had happened inside that school as the rest of the world was finding out that same gruesome news. That was 8 years ago today. We mark today that tragic anniversary of the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School. Since that day, I've gotten to know those families, the mothers and the fathers of the children that were killed, the daughters, the siblings of the educators who were killed. There were 6 educators inside Sandy Hook Elementary School who lost their lives that day, heroes all. There were 20 children. I've also gotten to know the community of Sandy Hook even better than I ever had during my 6 years representing them in the House of Representatives. Sandy Hook was and is a miraculous place. As much as the world saw evil that day, perpetuated by a young man named Adam Lanza, what happened in the hours and days, weeks, and months following in and around Sandy Hook told us what really sits inside of us, and that is a indescribable goodness, an ability to meet evil with all sorts of generosity that poured onto Sandy Hook from all over the world in big ways and small ways. Teddy bears were sent into Sandy Hook by the thousands in the days and weeks afterwards. A fund was set up for the families of the victims. Millions of dollars went into that fund to help pay for the college educations of the brothers and sisters who were left behind. The community wrapped its arms around those families, around the first responders, and well, Sandy Hook will never, ever be the same ever again. I was able to see firsthand what truly lies inside all of us. Over the last 8 years, we've tried to make good by the memory of those kids. There is no way to fill that hole, but I have watched as communities have been changed through the generosity that has come out of that tragedy. Almost every family established a unique not-for-profit that's doing all sorts of incredible work, all sort of based in many ways off of the loves of those children. There are charities that are building playgrounds for the kids who loved to climb and swing. There are charities that are providing access to animals for young kids in need, in memory of the kids who died that day who loved animals. There are charities that are building social emotional health. I'm trying to make sure that you never, ever get in a situation ever again where a young man like Adam Lanza feels so separated from society, his community, his peers, and reality that someone thinks to do what he did. Just on the charitable side of the equation, there's so much over the last 8 years that has happened, that has changed people's lives, that has saved lives because of what those families and what the community of Newtown has done. There's been policy change as well. We passed the Mental Health Reform Act here in the United States Senate, and the House signed into law one of the last things that President Obama did before he left office. And of course, we have had an ongoing conversation about the way in which we change our gun laws. Many of us in Connecticut have strong feelings that if Adam Lanza wasn't able to get his hands as easily on a semi-automatic military-style weapon, that he may not have ever made the journey to that school that morning. And so we continue in our work to try to reset the gun laws of this nation, to try to make sure that no tragedy like that ever happens again simply because of ease of access to a weapon of that power. But about a month after that shooting in Sandy Hook Elementary School, I had the chance to visit a community center in the north end of Hartford. I'd just been sworn in as a senator. The tragedy in Sandy Hook happened after my election to the Senate, but before I had been sworn in. After I was sworn into the Senate, I went to a community center in the north end of Hartford where I met there with the families of the victims of gun violence from that neighborhood. By the time Sandy Hook had happened in 2012, 20 young men and women had lost their lives to gunfire in Hartford. And the families that we met there that day, their hearts grieved deeper than anyone else for the families in Sandy Hook because they knew what that pain is like. They had lost sons and daughters themselves, but they were also furious that the whole country was waking up to the epidemic of gun violence in this country after Newtown, when it had been happening in Hartford and Bridgeport and New Haven and New Orleans and Chicago and Los Angeles and Baltimore for decades, without much action and without much attention from the mainstream news media or from those in power. Many of us had to reconcile the ways in which we had spent our public career in the weeks and months after Sandy Hook. I'm embarrassed by the fact that I didn't do more when I was in the House of Representatives, that I didn't do more when I was in the state legislature to try to address the epidemic of gun violence in this country, wherever it happens. And there were many people in this chamber who stood up in the wake of Sandy Hook and decided that they were going to lead, people like Pat Toomey, people like Joe Manchin, in ways that they hadn't led before. I think we've all had to reassess our priorities. We've all had to think about whether we've measured up to this moment that we live in today, where 100 people die from gun violence, and a lot of kids who go to school around this country just expect that at some point in their young lives, they will be met with a mass shooting. And so we come here 8 years later, and we try to measure what has happened. Have we made enough change? And we try to recommit ourselves to these ideas moving forward. I'm proud of many of the things that we have done. I'm proud of all of those charitable efforts. I'm proud of the Mental Health Reform Act. I'm proud that we've put more money into school safety. I'm proud that a lot of private sector entities have stood up to stop weapons from being carried into public spaces. But I'm also furious. I'm also furious that there are easy, popular things that we could be doing to stop the likelihood of another Sandy Hook, to reduce the level of gun violence that happens in our city, and we choose not to take those steps. Now, universal background checks wouldn't have saved the lives of those kids in Sandy Hook, but those parents came here and lobbied for that legislation in 2013 because they know that if that legislation was in place, there would be a whole lot of other kids alive throughout this country because the flow of illegal guns would be stunted into our cities and many of our neighborhoods. And those families in Sandy Hook, they don't necessarily care how it gets done. They just want to make sure that there are less parents that ever have to go through what they've gone through. And despite the fact that 95% of Americans support something like universal background checks, we still haven't done it here, an example where democracy just doesn't seem to be working. So we still have lots to do, and I'm sure I'll get the opportunity over the course of 2021 to talk a lot about the path forward on changing our gun laws. But the final thing that I want to say today before I yield the floor to Senator Blumenthal is that for those Americans who haven't had to come face to face with a tragedy like that, maybe for those that haven't been around that kind of pain and sorrow, maybe it's a little bit hard to understand perspective. One of the things that we've tried to do in the last 8 years is to, on this day, the 1 year, the 2 year, the 3 year, the 4 year mark, now the 8 year mark, is to just ask people on this day to go out and do something nice for a friend, for a relative, for a stranger. Just act in a kind, generous way. And maybe over the course of the next year, make it a habit to do a little bit more than you would have done otherwise to help people in and around you in the ways that people helped the community of Sandy Hook, the parents, the relatives, in small and big ways in the wake of the tragedy 8 years ago. When you're around that kind of loss and pain, when you think about what it's like to lose a child, I think it helps give some perspective as to what's really important in this world. We have a habit in this business to treat each other unkindly. And I'm guilty of that just like everyone else in this body likely is. Especially these days, we tend to fall into this trap too easily in which we assume bad motives to folks who just think differently than us. There's some folks out there today who, won't go to businesses that are owned by Republicans or won't associate themselves with folks who might have more progressive views than they are. Politics matters, don't get me wrong, but there are things that matter more than politics. And when we think about what those families are going through today as they are forced to relive the events of that day in Sandy Hook Elementary School, we should be reminded of how lucky we are to still be on this earth. For those of us that haven't endured that kind of loss, how lucky we are to still have our children by our side. And we should remember that kindness, that treating people respectfully, that understanding what's important in the long run, family, friendships, relationships, that's one of the lessons, I hope, of Sandy Hook. So this is never a fun day to come down to the floor and mark the anniversary of Sandy Hook, but I want to finish by just saying thank you to the parents and the families for letting Senator Blumenthal and I into their lives. I have these friendships, these bonds with those families today that I never expected, but now are maybe more meaningful to me than any other relationships that I have. And I do have strong words often for my colleagues about our unwillingness to make change in this body, but it is because when my public service is done, the measure of whether I succeeded or failed, to me in many ways, is in the hands of those families. Whether they think that I've made a difference to honor the memory of their children is probably what will matter to me more than anything else when I hang up my public service spikes a few years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I thank them for enduring this pain, for reaching out to those of us in positions of leadership to help guide us, and for finding all sorts of ways to lift up the light and the memory of their children, of their parents, of those that fell 8 years ago today in Sandy Hook. I yield the floor.
Madam Madam President,